All right. Very good. Just slide advance here. All right, well, thank everyone for coming out. I'm Tomas Walker. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Affairs at Dexcom, where I oversee our work with global clinical initiatives, including things like investigator-initiated studies, automated insulin delivery, where you heard from my colleague Steve Patek earlier today, as well as medical and scientific writing, a few hundred other things regularly. It's a small company still. People fail to realize that Dexcom is a very small company, despite the great work we've done. So as disclosures, I am an employee and shareholder at Dexcom. My talk will include discussions of off-label use and investigational products. So I'd like to talk about the burden of diabetes. So I saw a lot of people here have MPHs, and we're all aware that there is an epidemic of chronic disease facing this country. And diabetes is playing a significant part of that. More than 34 million Americans have diabetes. More than a quarter of our senior population has diabetes. The country is not getting any younger, at least I'm not. More than 88 million people have prediabetes, and we are very, very conservatively spending $327 billion a year on diabetes care. I don't know anyone in healthcare who thinks that that is actually anywhere near what we're spending. The best guesstimates are probably closer to $500 billion a year. And if there's one number up there that ought to scare you, it's the fact that 88 million people have prediabetes, which means that I can look at their lab tests and tell you that this is not a normal glycemic pattern. Well, how does a person manage their diabetes? Well, a person with diabetes manages it with insulin delivered either by injections, 2 or more injections a day, commonly self-monitoring of blood glucose, though we'll touch on CGM here, our continuous glucose monitoring. But diabetes is it's difficult and costly. So we learned 100 years ago, actually it's 100 years this year, this is the 100th anniversary of insulin being discovered. And the Canadian $100 dollar note and the $2 Canadian coin are both commemorating it this year, if you haven't seen them. But we knew 2 injections of insulin a day would extend life for decades. Patients had to do 4 to 6 finger sticks a day to maintain their control. That's 150 finger sticks a month. That's 50,000 finger sticks over 30 years. And if they did that, they would have pretty decent diabetes control. And then in the late 70s and into the 80s and 90s, we started to get talk about new insulin compounds, new insulin analogs, more predictable short-acting insulins, more predictable and safer long-acting insulins with less hypoglycemia, and these became very widespread. And there were numerous editorials that all told us that we are entering a new era of diabetes care. Diabetes care will now be safer, easier, patients will have great control, and what do you think happened? Absolutely nothing. Yeah. So this was looking at the hemoglobin A1C, which I won't go into the details of the A1C. We could certainly argue the problems with the A1C, but it's a way of averaging glucose. Certainly at a population level, it's still a very good standard. And a person with well-controlled diabetes should have an A1C of 7% or less. So in 2001, a person with type 1 diabetes had an A1C of about 8.8, and in 2007, they had an A1C of about 8.8. So their blood sugars were averaging about 200, despite numerous advances in insulin. And there was finally, I think, some good, honest discussion that maybe the problem is not the pharmaceutical compounds, but maybe the problem is the access to information to manage the disease. People needed to do a better job managing their sugar, but it's painful to poke your fingers. I don't know how many people here have ever done a finger stick, but imagine doing them consistently across the day. And honestly, to manage your diabetes well, you're going to do 6 to 8 or even 10 finger sticks a day for most patients. So we knew we had to develop continuous measurements. And it only took about 40 years. The first paper on continuous glucose monitoring was written in 1967 in the journal Nature by Dr. Updike and Dr. Higgs. And if you go there and look at this article, they talk about how you take a platinum cathode and you take a silver anode, you wrap it with some semi-permeable membranes, you coat it with glucose oxidase, and you can generate an electrical current which is proportional to the concentration of the glucose that this electrode is exposed to. And in this article, they comment, there might be something here that we can use to help people with diabetes and monitor their glucose more. And it took 40 years to bring that to fruition. And in 2006 was the year everything changed. The first continuous glucose monitors that displayed the data in real time became available to patients and clinicians to use. And you know, I was a very early adopter of this technology. I was in practice at the time, and one of my claims to fame is I actually purchased the second, third, and fourth kits that the company ever sold and started using them immediately on my patients because I believed that the issue for my patients had always been access to information. And there were a number of studies that were published around this time as the sensors came out that seemed to support this. So this is just one study, and we'll get on this in a minute, but I just want to point out one study. In 2006, these patients wore a blinded device, meaning they had no glucose data for the first 3 days they wore it. Their average sugar was 200 milligrams per deciliter. After that 3-day blinded wear, the system was switched on. The patients could see their glucose data. And after 3 days of seeing their data, they brought their glucose down to 176 milligrams per deciliter. And they wore it again for the next 3 days, and they brought their average down to 148 milligrams per deciliter. So they brought their average glucose down by 25% by just seeing the information. You're not going to see a huge education impact in 6 days unless it's some sort of a diabetes boot camp. Okay? But once patients saw the data, the behavioral and the glycemic changes occurred almost immediately. And I would encourage you to think about it like this. So I had a busy clinical practice. Bob comes to see me and he brings me his logbook and he's doing 5 finger sticks a day. He woke up in the middle of the night, checked his sugar, it was 129, okay by me. 83 when he got up for breakfast to make coffee. 306 on Saturday after lunch, okay, well, had a late brunch. Okay, didn't do a great job with that, but by dinner time, his sugar was back down to 110. And when he went to bed, he was at 87. So this is a person living with type 1 diabetes, doing 5 finger sticks a day, and 4 out of his 5 finger sticks that day were in target range. Pretty hard as a clinician for me to yell at this guy, okay? But here's what happened when we put them on continuous glucose monitoring. We realized that we were missing the highs. We were missing the fact that he was spending 6 hours high postprandially. We missed the hypoglycemic events that occurred in the late morning. And if you added alerts and alarms, you would have seen urgent low predictions occur. So we were realizing we were not seeing the entire picture on our patients, and we were missing much of what they needed. So one of the discussions that came up very early in accessing continuous glucose monitoring data was, is it the number or is it the trend? Well, I would argue that trending information is just as important as the snapshot, if not more. So if you consider the soccer field here, there's 6 players on the field and there's a ball and the ball's in motion. Which way is the ball going? You don't know. So you just had lunch an hour and a half ago. You poke your finger right now, your blood sugar is 220. Which way is your blood sugar going? And this is what matters with diabetes data. Because if your sugar is 220 and dropping like a rock, you're probably going to reconsider if you should be eating a little bit of glucose or candy. If your sugar is 220 and climbing again, you may have to consider that, did I take my correct bolus of insulin? Did I do a hand-to-mouth moment and forget about it? There may be more to the picture here. And this was actually a little study I did with a friend of mine at the university. So Carol and I actually got some early CGM data, some early CGM devices, and we obscured the number. And we put the patients on the systems with access to the, you can see they have the range there, and they know that it's going up or down, and they're looking at the last 3 hours of their glucose. And what we found was displaying the numerical data did not improve control when compared to numerically blinded units. And this raised a lot of questions. Was this the right way to go? Now, I think it's important that patients have as much information as possible. And I believe that both factors are there, but patients interpret the movement because we are inherently designed to interpret movement. If you cannot predict the behavior of an object in motion, you're not here today because your ancestors got eaten by a lion on the savannah. So, and the interest in publications continues to climb. There are now more than 1,000 publications, if you go to the National Library of Medicine and search continuous glucose monitoring, addressing this topic. And look at the increase in publication and awareness simply as the technologies have evolved and they have become increasingly adopted. And what have all of these publications demonstrated for us? They've demonstrated more time in range, that patients have more time between 70 and 180, which is where you want to keep them, between 70 milligrams and 180 milligrams per deciliter. They had better A1C outcomes. They're having fewer episodes of hypoglycemia. They're getting better sleep. They have alerts and alarms to warn them about impending hypoglycemia, so they have a greater sense of well-being and less diabetes distress. Diabetes is a very distressing disease for many patients to manage, and many of them are managing it in an information vacuum. And as we heard numerous times today, the smartphone quite literally changed everything. And I am not entirely convinced it's all been good. But one of the things that came up was if the CGM data has to be where a patient wants it, most of them are going to want it on their phone. So the CGM data now goes directly to your phone. But once the data goes directly to your phone, we can put it in the cloud. And once the data is in the cloud, you can put it anywhere. And very early on, the decision was made to allow the data to be mirrored. So you could share the data with one person. So my wife in Reno can look at my glucose anytime she wants and knows that my sugar is stable when I'm traveling. And they can have different alerts and alarms. There's also been a few papers published showing that people who use this feature and have somebody they interact with on their diabetes, a spouse, a friend, have better control overall. But one of the early stories that came in is the quote here, where a parent wrote in and thanked us for this feature, that she was finally able to allow her 9-year-old to go to a slumber party. Now, we've actually had some fun looking at this data. Once in a while, pre-COVID, we would sit around once every couple of weeks and have some coffee with the engineers and ask questions. So just out of curiosity, who do you think is the #1 group that uses share and follow, the ability to follow data? Parents following small children. Okay, you know who the #2 is? Adolescent females. Adolescent females share their data on average with 8 to 9 people. Okay, you know who is the least likely to share their glucose data? Adolescent males. It's like having raised one of each, you know, there are days where adolescent males are barely verbal. And but it was fascinating to me to see this. And we could actually see it when we looked at the data streams. So the smartphone also enables access to many other tools to enable patients to do better with these systems. Yeah, and I was afraid of that. Unfortunately, it didn't work. There's a voice over here where a user can say, "Hello, Siri, what's my glucose?" And Siri will respond and say, "Tomas, your blood sugar is 100 and stable." So patients can interact with it. And when we went and looked at how interaction with the data in that particular use case scenario worked out, we saw that Siri users had more time in range and better average glucose values than people who were not, because they had access to this tool if they wished to use it. And better data will facilitate better decision making. When you walk into a patient room and you have 12 to 15 minutes on a good day to spend time with this patient to help them manage their disease, which piece of paper do you want in your hand? Okay. On the left, we have an extremely detailed logbook that actually makes my eyes hurt. And on the right, I can see that my patient's average glucose is 155. He's spending 76% of his time in target range. And where is he having a consistent pattern of hyperglycemia? After lunch. So does this guide your discussion? Very much so. And this is the sort of thing that we began to see with the data. And as the recognition of the potential of CGM data became clearer, there was also a belief that we needed to standardize the data. And I have to admit, I was not on board with this concept when it first hit, because having been an early adopter of the technology in practice, I had developed my own thinking on how to analyze the data. But when you begin to roll technology like this out to millions of people and tens of thousands of clinicians, having a standardized approach makes a lot of sense. So this is the ambulatory glucose profile, or the AGP. The AGP is an ACE-recommended standardized reporting format to review the continuous glucose monitoring data that has 3 distinct sections. You get a summary of the glucose values at the top. You get an hour-by-hour statistics, including averages and modal day plots in the middle, so you can still see we're having our postprandials at lunchtime. And you get single-day glucose value callouts on the bottom to show you how it's working and how the progress is going. So clearly, standardizing the data is the way to go, and this has been widely adopted by all of the manufacturers, most of the manufacturers at this time. But we've got this great pile of data that's sitting in the cloud, right? So once it's in the cloud, we can subject it to supercomputing, to modeling, to forecasting abilities. We can apply Steve's amazing models, of which I understand about 10% on a good day. And we can then email summaries back to patients, providing them insights into their own behavior and how it's going. And you would be surprised how many people opt into this. You have to opt into this. We don't provide it automatically. You just have to go into the app and say, send me my weekly reports, and ask for what you want, and you get them sent out once a week. You could even pick your delivery time. Anybody want to guess when the #1 delivery time for report requests is? Monday morning. I don't know why, but everybody wants their reports on Monday morning. But regulatory bodies have now recognized that continuous glucose monitoring data, which is becoming the standard of care for people living with diabetes, could do better if there was a standardized approach to the systems also. And the FDA authorized integrated CGM, or interoperable continuous glucose monitoring, to streamline the review process, to reduce the pre-market burden, meaning that every time there's a generational change, do I really have to go back and do a pre-pivotal, a pivotal, and a post-pivotal study? And the FDA said, no, as long as you can meet certain standards, the burden will be dramatically reduced. It allows you to integrate the data into other platforms quickly, and it increases that awareness to new technology. And interoperability is really about what it's all about. It's about improving access. It's about exploring possibilities. It's about putting the data in hands of people that I don't know, who are probably smarter than me, who have an idea on how this data can benefit patients. It's about putting it into apps, into insulin pumps to help automate insulin delivery, to putting it to, what about people who don't want to wear pumps? Only about 30% of people with type 1 diabetes wear pumps, and that's despite me telling every single patient in my practice who has type 1 diabetes, if you want a pump, I will get you a pump. It can be shared with better data sharing with loved ones, and we can integrate into electronic health records like Epic and Cerner and eClinicalWorks, and put those reports right at your hands as a clinician. When you walk in the room to see your patient, under your lab reports, it says continuous glucose monitoring, and you click and you get reports. And this has all been thanks to the rise of the API, or application programming interfaces. And what has that really amounted to? 3,500 different developers, 2,000 registered apps, more than 50 commercialized apps today, 140,000 app connections, and more than 5 million data requests per day. And we have not gone out of our way to advertise the ability to do this. It's really been just about, hey, this technology might help you. And then other apps and companies coming to us and talking about how to do it. Now, until very recently, all of this data had a 3-hour delay. That delay was primarily artificial at the request of the regulatory agencies. And last month, I'm pleased to announce that we have started offering real-time APIs, meaning that the digital health partner gets enabled by the CGM users to send their CGM data to a partner app or device in near real time. So you can get earlier feedback, individualized insights, and future pathways are being laid and opportunities for better integration. And this is a picture of the Garmin system, who is one of our very early partners, that is now pulling CGM data real time into their applications. So if you have type 1 diabetes and you're exercising, the ability to model and predict a potential hypoglycemia is critical. And talking to some of the very professional athlete level type 1 diabetics, boy, they have some amazing insight into how to predict the behavior of your liver when you're exercising. It's fascinating. So where else do we want to go with this data? What's next? So this is actually one of my passions. I love diabetes camp. Okay? Anybody ever work at diabetes summer camp with the kids? It's a blast, but the absolute worst thing you can hear when you show up is you've got the night shift. Because when that means, as the clinician at diabetes camp, you're going to be carrying around a pocket of glucagon and a pocket of glucose tablets with a walkie-talkie stuck in your ear all night, going from cabin to cabin to cabin, treating hypoglycemia. So we already had the ability to share the glucose data with the share and follow system. So with a little bit of hacking and a couple of interested parents who work for Dexcom, we actually built a dashboard that we installed in the medical cabin. So all 82 kids who showed up at camp on continuous glucose monitoring could be monitored remotely from a single spot. It was absolutely game-changing for the folks at summer camp. Even my anti-technology counselors were like, this has changed everything, because there's always an eye in the sky. There's always someone watching to see what's going on. We could see the kids who are getting impending hypos. We could see the kids who are getting impending hypers. We could see the adolescent male who left his pump in the shower and didn't put it back on before he went out to the horse barns. So really, really an amazing experience. This is not commercialized yet. This was all done under an IRB approved study. This is also another case scenario that has been getting increasing interest in healthcare. And that's the ability to use CGM in the inpatient setting, which is also not FDA approved at this time. But during the COVID pandemic, very early on, there were a couple of papers, one came out of China and one came out of the UK, that said, there's a problem. If you have poorly controlled type diabetes, your mortality rate is 500%, someone who's not diabetic coming in with COVID. So there was a very early recognition we had to aggressively manage diabetes. And what you see here was a hybrid protocol that integrated real-time CGM with point-of-care testing, and that they found this was useful in managing critically ill patients with COVID-19 requiring insulin infusions. So I think we can assume that there's going to be a lot of interest in where this can go also, because this data is so useful once it's in the right hands. So consider that the data is out there, okay? And better data is going to allow better therapy adjustments. And patients and users will guide us. Chronic disease management is about data. It's going to allow us to individualize patient care plans, and I hope truly begin to improve care, both at the population level and at the individual level. Aggregated health data, looking at CGM, is now letting us see that patients who spend more time in range have less time with hypoglycemia, or have less issues with micro or macrovascular disease. They have less retinopathy. So most of us in our careers will have more than one aha moment where something suddenly clicks, whether it's that day in biochemistry where this finally makes sense to me, or if it's a day in clinical practice. So the first continuous glucose monitor devices were commercialized in March of 2006. In June of 2006, I was in a diabetes chat forum looking and seeing what people were talking about, because patients teach us all the time how to better take care of them if we just look for the information. And I saw they were talking about CGM. So I went into that subgroup, and they were talking about their uses of these early devices. If you were using a continuous glucose monitor in June of 2006, you were paying cash for it, okay? No insurances were paying for them at this time. The patients were downloading their data, writing on it, scanning it back up and discussing with each other. No TikTok, no Instagram. This was old school, all right? And look at the information this patient posted. I can see when she got up. I can see when she went to bed. I can see what she had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I can see how she treated her hypoglycemia. Did she drink 4 ounces of soda and wait 15 minutes and check her blood sugar in 15 minutes? No, she did what we all did. She drank the entire can of Coke because she was hypoglycemic, okay? And do you see what she had for dinner? She had for dinner a giant basket of French fries that she estimated to be about 80 grams of carbohydrates. So my first thought was, well, we need to work on your carb counting. My second thought was, if I asked this patient what she had for dinner, she would have told me she had a chicken Caesar salad, no dressing, no croutons. So the patients were using the data that we were struggling to understand. Quite literally, the week I saw this, I had a discussion with some other diabetes specialists about using CGM who told me, do not do it. The technology is not stable. We don't know what to do with it as clinicians, and our patients will not know what to do with it. And I disagree completely, because Dr. Elliot Jocelyn taught us that in diabetes, the careful instruction of the patient is the keystone to treatment. Managing diabetes is about information, and giving patients the tools they need makes all the difference in the world. And I collect diabetes antiques, and that is actually a copy of the Treatment of Diabetes Mellitus, 1916, first edition. I've actually read it cover to cover. You could take that book and pull the carbohydrate and nutritional counseling tables out of it and use them today. It's a fascinating book to read, to realize how much was actually known, but the one piece they were missing was the ability to use insulin. And with that, thank you.